I remember that evening in the hotel ballroom in Santa Monica, as if it were painted on the inside of my eyelids, the golden light pouring over the tables, the gentle clink of champagne glasses, the steady rhythm of a jazz band filling the air with something warm and reassuring. Guests were laughing. Amy was darting around trying to make sure every little detail of the night went smoothly, and for a brief moment I thought everything was as perfect as it looked from the outside. Michael, my fiancé, stood by the entrance with that quiet pride of his, greeting friends and family, while Vanessa twirled on the dance floor in a gown that shimmered like foam catching the moonlight. People said she looked radiant, and she did, her bridesmaids spinning around her as though nothing in life could ever interrupt their joy. I caught myself smiling, letting the idea settle in my chest that this was the beginning of something that might finally feel like home. But perfection has a way of slipping through your fingers when you least expect it, and I felt the shift before I could name it. 10 minutes passed, maybe a little more, and I realized I hadn't seen Vanessa in the room. At first, I thought she might have been caught up with family photos or fixing her lipstick in the powder room, and I pushed away the unease that crept in like a cold draft through a cracked window. When Matt, one of the younger waiters, approached Michael with his nervous eyes and hesitant whisper, the world seemed to tilt just slightly, and even though I couldn't hear every word, I saw the way Michael's face froze. Later he told me Matt had said she was in the restroom with another man, but in that moment I only felt the way sound seemed to vanish from the room, leaving nothing but the buzz of blood in my ears and the strange stillness of a party still moving without me. Michael's body stiffened as if his skin could no longer contain the storm that was already rising inside him, and I remember watching him walk through the crowd with a determination that was frightening in its silence. Amy intercepted him halfway, her face drawn tight, her voice unsteady as she asked where he was going and whether he was all right, but he shook her off without a word. I followed his movements with my eyes as he pushed down that hallway, the music from the ballroom fading into nothing but muffled echoes, his shoes striking against the floor like a drumbeat I couldn't bear to hear. By the time he reached the door, I think we all knew that something had already cracked, because silence had fallen in my chest, and the only thing I could feel was the way the room seemed to hold its breath. When he opened that door, the image was burned into us forever, the kind of moment you don't unsee no matter how much you beg time to rewind. Vanessa was pinned against the tiled wall, her body tangled with Kevin's in a way that left no room for doubt. Their faces pressed together with a hunger so raw it made the air in the hallway heavy. There was no mistaking it, no chance to say it was innocent, no excuse that could soften what was right there in front of our eyes. For Michael, it was the instant his life collapsed into something unrecognizable, and for me, standing just far enough to witness the tremor ripple through him, it was the second I realized that sometimes betrayal isn't quiet or hidden. It's loud enough to silence a room, cruel enough to echo for years. The first seconds were almost surreal, like the world was still catching up with what my eyes were forcing me to believe. Michael's voice broke the air, trembling with a fury I had never heard in him before, and only then did Vanessa and Kevin pull apart, their faces turning toward him with the kind of horror you can't disguise. Vanessa's skin drained of color in an instant, her lips still parted as if she could somehow explain away the undeniable. I saw her mouth forming words, pleas, excuses, the kind of desperate fragments a person reaches for when they know the truth has already scorched through the room. But her voice was swallowed by the look in Michael's eyes. Kevin, ever the smooth one, had the audacity to step forward, his posture calm in a way that only stoked the fire. His voice was low, almost condescending, as he suggested they handle this like adults, as if Michael's entire life hadn't just collapsed at his feet. That arrogance snapped something inside of him, and before I could even process what was happening, Michael's hand shot out, gripping Kevin by the collar with a force that was all instinct and pain. In one swift motion, he flung him out of the stall, the sound of his body slamming against the porcelain sink echoing like a gunshot. The fury that poured out of Michael then wasn't measured or careful. It was volcanic, the kind of rage that comes when humiliation, heartbreak, and betrayal collide all at once. His fists came down on Kevin with a rhythm that was almost terrifying in its intensity, each blow carrying the weight of a man who had just had the ground ripped from under him. Kevin tried to block, to swing back, but against Michael's adrenaline, he was nothing but a stumbling body caught in the storm. The sharp crack of bone against bone, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the guttural sound of anger ripping out of Michael's throat. It was chaos contained in that narrow restroom. Vanessa's screams pierced through the madness, her voice rising higher with every blow, pleading with him to stop, her hands reaching out but never daring to touch him. The door burst open, guests flooding in with shocked faces, the laughter and music from the ballroom colliding with the horror inside that tiled room. I saw Amy's hand fly to her mouth, eyes wide, and Matt hovered helplessly near the doorway, frozen in place. A couple of men rushed forward, their arms locking around Michael, dragging him back while Kevin curled on the floor, blood running down his chin, his body folding in on itself. The room smelled of sweat, iron, and something heavier, shame that none of us could scrub away. The room was spinning when they finally pulled Michael off Kevin, a couple of men holding his arms back while Kevin staggered to his feet, blood running down his mouth as someone yelled for an ambulance. I can still hear the shuffle of shoes on the tile, the nervous, panicked whispers, and the gasps as Kevin was half carried out, leaving Michael and Vanessa in the wreckage of what was supposed to be their wedding day. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than the fight, and when Vanessa reached for him, desperate, trembling, her mascara streaking down her face, he recoiled so sharply that the rejection cut sharper than any punch he had thrown. His voice, low and icy, warned her not to touch him, and when she broke into sobs, trying to piece together words that no longer mattered, he spat out the truth in one line: she had destroyed everything, and slammed out of the restroom, the door rattling in its frame. Michael stood there with fists throbbing, the sting of every strike still echoing in his bones, his chest heaving like his lungs could barely contain the rage burning inside. Vanessa crumpled against the wall, her dress torn, her face buried in her hands, the kind of image that might have once stirred sympathy, but now only fueled the hollow anger inside him. He looked down at her, not as a bride, but as the reason the night had turned into a nightmare. I can imagine the part of him that wanted to leave her there in that ruin, to walk out and never look back, to slam the door hard enough to drown out the sight of her tears. But something shifted in him, that strange clarity that sometimes follows chaos, when the noise inside your head fades and leaves behind only the sharp outline of truth. He realized he was not the one who needed to disappear, not the one who should slink away in shame. That burden belonged to her, and as that thought rooted itself in his chest, his anger cooled into something far more unsettling, calm calculation. He drew in a long breath, his eyes steady, and told her to get up, his voice flat, almost mechanical. She looked up at him with swollen eyes, trying again to form words of apology, but he cut her down with a single command to be silent, his tone slicing through the air like steel. When he grabbed her hand, the grip was unrelenting, not of affection, but of intent, dragging her toward the door with a finality that terrified even her. She stumbled, her voice breaking into a weak, almost childlike whisper, asking what he was doing, but he didn't slow, didn't answer. It was the first step of turning her humiliation inside out, of dragging the truth she thought might stay hidden into the light of the ballroom, where the music had already stopped, and every guest was waiting for the next act of a wedding that had become something else entirely, a spectacle of betrayal. He didn't slow down, didn't look back, and when Vanessa whispered her weak protests, Michael's only response was a cold promise that she would soon find out. The ballroom opened before them in a rush of light and hushed confusion, the music faltering mid-note as though even the band sensed the storm breaking through the doors. I still remember the way every head turned, conversations falling into silence, the warmth of the celebration bleeding away in an instant. Michael, tall and imposing, his hand clamped around Vanessa's wrist so firmly she didn't even struggle, cut through the crowd until he reached the very center of the room. There, under the chandelier that had seemed so magical only minutes before, the air turned heavy with expectation. The stillness was unbearable, the kind that tightens around your ribs and makes every heartbeat sound like thunder in your ears. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, some clutching half-empty glasses, others lifting their phones as if this was still just a wedding game, a toast, a performance meant to entertain. But when Michael's voice rang out, slicing through the silence with an authority that left no doubt, the atmosphere shifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, steady and deliberate, "I have an important announcement to make." His tone carried no warmth, no trace of celebration. It was the voice of a man no longer bound by love, but fueled by the raw need to expose the truth. Murmurs rippled through the room, a wave of whispers brushing across the walls, but he continued, his words dripping with bitter irony. "You all came here tonight to celebrate love," he said, pausing just long enough to let the weight of the words settle. "But not every kind of love deserves to be celebrated." And then he turned to her. Vanessa, pale as ivory under the unforgiving lights, her breath coming fast, her eyes darting desperately across the faces of friends and relatives who had suddenly become a jury. It was a moment that stripped her bare in front of everyone, and she seemed to shrink under the force of it. His question landed like a blade. "Tell me, Vanessa, who do you choose? Me or the man who's on his way to the emergency room right now?" A collective gasp rolled through the hall, guests shifting in their seats, unsure if they should intervene or simply watch the unraveling. Vanessa's lips trembled as she whispered that this wasn't the time or the place, but Michael's reply was swift, unyielding, final. "No," he said, his voice carrying across the room with chilling certainty. "This is exactly the time and the place, and you will answer right here in front of them all." Her knees seemed to weaken, her chest heaving as her gaze searched the crowd, but there was nowhere left to hide. The whispers in the ballroom swelled into a low roar, people shifting in their chairs, glancing at one another with the kind of nervous curiosity that only grows when a scandal unfolds in real time. One of Vanessa's bridesmaids, Amy, rose from her seat with trembling hands, clearly intending to reach her, but Michael stopped her with nothing more than the lift of his palm, the gesture sharp and commanding. His voice, steady but merciless, cut through the air again. "Choose, Vanessa." His eyes locked on hers with such intensity that even from across the room I could feel the weight of it. She stood frozen, her silence louder than any confession, and the hush that fell over the whole pressed down on all of us like an invisible hand. It was unbearable, that quiet, so absolute it seemed the chandeliers themselves might shatter under the tension. Michael's gaze didn't waver as he turned toward the wedding planners hovering near the sound system, their clipboards clutched tightly to their chests. "Turn on the cameras and microphones," he ordered, his words crisp and unyielding. "Let this be remembered." The organizers hesitated, caught between duty and disbelief, but one of them fumbled forward and obeyed, the soft click of the equipment magnifying the dread that hung in the room. Vanessa covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking, and whispered for him to stop, but her plea dissolved before it ever reached him. "Stop?" Michael's laugh was sharp and bitter, the kind of sound that makes your stomach twist because it carries no joy, only disillusionment. "You thought you could destroy everything, and now it's me who has to stop? No, Vanessa. I decide how this ends." His movements were deliberate as he reached for a champagne flute, resting on the table where their wedding bands had been displayed hours earlier. He slipped his own ring from his pocket, lifting it high enough for everyone to see, the gold catching the harsh light of the chandelier. His voice deepened, carrying through the hall. "This was supposed to be a symbol of our love. Instead, it will remind me that I survived betrayal." The sound of the ring dropping into the glass was dull but devastating, echoing louder than any applause the room had offered earlier that night. Guests gasped, some covering their mouths, others fumbling with their phones, uncertain if they should record or look away. Michael's eyes never left hers as he raised the flute, and with one long swallow he drained it, the ring clinking at the bottom like a final sentence. For a heartbeat, time stood still. Every face turned toward him, every breath caught in the weight of what had just been done, and then the room exhaled in a chorus of shock, a single collective gasp that told us all nothing would ever return to what it had been. The sound of scattered applause broke the silence, awkward and hesitant at first, then swelling just enough to fill the room with an uncomfortable rhythm. Michael dabbed at his mouth with a napkin, his eyes never leaving Vanessa, and declared with a calmness that chilled me more than his rage ever could, that the ring was now part of him, not as a symbol of love but as proof he had survived betrayal. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, yet the words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through every guest in that ballroom. Vanessa stood rooted in place, her fingers clutching the hem of her dress so tightly the fabric bunched and wrinkled, her cheeks burning red with humiliation as eyes darted toward her and hands fumbled for phones to record what was no longer a wedding but a spectacle. Michael set the empty flute down with a sharp clink, his voice steady as he said that was all he had left to share, thanking everyone for their attention as if he were closing a business presentation, not a love story. He turned toward the exit, his steps measured, the sound of his shoes echoing against the polished floor, as if he were already walking away from the life he had almost chosen. Behind him came a voice, trembling yet desperate, Vanessa's plea for him to stop, for him to look at her. He turned, just for a second, his face carved from stone, and cut her down with one line. She was no longer his problem. Then he kept moving, leaving her in the spotlight of shame, surrounded by gasps and flashes from a dozen raised cameras. At the doorway, Michael paused, the kind of pause that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. Behind him, Vanessa quivered like a shadow about to collapse, her tears catching the light, her gaze darting through the crowd as if searching for an ally who no longer existed. The weight of the moment pressed in on all of us, a strange mixture of awe, pity, and unease. People whispered to one another, the story already mutating and spreading with every glance and murmur, but none of them dared step forward. The bride who had once commanded the room now stood small and cornered, her beauty smudged with mascara and regret. Michael turned his eyes across the hall, scanning the faces of friends, relatives, colleagues, all of them waiting for him to either leave or explain. Some had already pieced it together. Rumors travel at lightning speed in rooms like that, but most were still holding their breath, caught between disbelief and hunger for confirmation. He knew, in that pause at the threshold, that the entire room was his to command if he chose, that silence was both his stage and his weapon. And in that moment, he decided he wasn't done yet. It took him only a heartbeat to decide, and that heartbeat changed everything. This was his night now, not hers, not theirs, his alone, and he would shape it into something no one would forget. Michael walked straight toward the small stage where the band had been playing, the soft hum of a saxophone trailing off as the musicians fell silent at the sight of his face. He didn't rush, he didn't stumble. His steps were steady, deliberate, almost regal in the way he carried himself. By the time he reached the microphone stand, the ballroom was already wrapped in a hush so thick you could almost hear the chandeliers creak. "Friends, may I have your attention?" he began, and though his voice was calm, there was a razor edge to it that made people freeze mid-breath. The murmur of side conversations died instantly. Forks were set down on plates, and even the waitstaff along the walls stood motionless. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't warmth. It was a flicker of irony that chilled more than it comforted. "We gathered here tonight to celebrate love," he said, and a ripple of unease moved through the room, because everyone knew the next words would not be what they expected. "Life has a way of surprising us," he continued, his gaze scanning the crowd like a teacher waiting for a class to admit its mistake. "And in those moments, the only thing that matters is whether you have the courage to face the truth." Vanessa took a trembling step forward, mascara streaks glistening under the chandeliers, but before she could speak, Michael raised his hand sharply, silencing her with the same authority he had silenced the band. "Not yet," he told her evenly, his eyes narrowing but his voice still eerily composed. "You'll have your chance to speak, but not now." He let the pause stretch, forcing the tension to coil tighter and tighter around the room. "This wedding isn't cancelled," he said at last, the calm finality of his words cutting through the air. "But it's no longer a celebration of love. Tonight will be something else entirely, a celebration of truth." A murmur ran through the guests, a sound of disbelief, of nervous laughter that died quickly in their throats. Michael leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice dropping lower, tinged with irony. "Just so you all understand, a few minutes ago I discovered that my bride chose to mark our special day with another man." The gasp that rippled through the hall was sharp, almost physical, like a cold wind sweeping across every table, leaving behind nothing but silence and shock. The shock rippled like a wave across the ballroom, gasps breaking out in pockets, whispers surging louder until they filled the air with disbelief. I saw one woman lift her hand to her mouth as though she could physically hold back the horror of his words, while Vanessa seemed to drain of every last trace of color, her body trembling as she clutched her dress like it might keep her from collapsing. And then, almost unbelievably, Michael smiled, a sharp, bitter twist of his lips, and told everyone there was no need for drama. His calmness was unnerving, his tone the voice of someone who had stepped beyond heartbreak and landed in a place colder, more deliberate. "We are here," he said, "to learn how to take life's lessons with dignity." His eyes flicked to Vanessa, and the silence that followed was suffocating. He let the pause hang before announcing a new idea, something that made people glance at one another in confusion, unsure if they were still at a wedding or had wandered into some twisted theater. "I'd like to introduce a new concept tonight," Michael said evenly. "A wedding of truth." Murmurs rose again, the phrase sinking into the crowd like a stone into water, and then he added, "And we'll begin with a little auction." The room broke into nervous laughter, the kind that bubbles up when people don't know whether to be horrified or entertained, whether this was a man unraveling or a man in complete control. "Tell me," he asked, his gaze pinned on Vanessa but his voice carrying across the room, "how much do you think freedom is worth?" The words hung in the air, sharp and unsettling, before he leaned in just slightly. "Let's start small. Who would like to buy the right to spend the rest of the evening with the bride?" The laughter grew louder this time, some guests shaking their heads in disbelief, others grinning despite themselves. And then, from the back, a man slurred by alcohol shouted, $10,000! A ripple of shock and glee swept through the room, and Michael nodded, smiling faintly, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. "Excellent. 10,000. Who'll go higher?" For the next 10 minutes, what should have been the most sacred night of his life dissolved into an absurd carnival. Guests, emboldened by the tension and drink, shouted bids for the smallest of privileges. One paid for the chance to cut the cake, another for the first tango with the bride, laughter and disbelief colliding into a strange kind of frenzy. Even the bouquet, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, was tossed into the madness as an item to be sold. And when the room was at its peak of chaos, Michael raised his glass high, his voice steady as he announced the finale. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the grand prize, the bride's dress." The words cracked through the air like a whip, half the guests erupting into laughter, the other half staring in stunned silence, while Vanessa stood frozen, her humiliation complete, her face burning as though the walls themselves were closing in. The ballroom erupted with uneasy laughter, some guests clutching their stomachs, others glancing around to see if this was truly happening, as though they needed confirmation that this was not some elaborate prank. Vanessa stood frozen, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest, as if she could shield herself from the humiliation pressing down from every angle, her face contorted with the kind of shame that makes you wish the floor would open and swallow you whole. Michael's voice carried above the noise, announcing that every dollar raised from the absurd auction would go to charity, so at least someone might benefit from a wedding that had lost every shred of its meaning. A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first and then louder, as though people had convinced themselves this chaos was entertainment, a tragic play with Michael as the unwilling but commanding star. It became theater, pure theater, every symbol of what should have been sacred twisted into a prop on his stage. The rings, the cake, the flowers, even the carefully chosen decorations became part of the act, their significance stripped away and replaced with bitter irony, and the strangest part was how quickly the crowd leaned into it. Guests who only an hour earlier had been dabbing tears of joy were now laughing, clapping, tossing out bids, as if the night had always been destined to end in spectacle. Michael stood there with a faint, unsettling smile, watching as his own heartbreak transformed into their entertainment, as if chaos itself had become the new center of the celebration. When the evening finally dragged itself toward its end, the air heavy with exhaustion and disbelief, Michael returned to the microphone. His voice was steady, almost warm, though the weight of his words cut deeper than any outburst of anger could have. "Thank you," he said, "to everyone who supported tonight's wedding of truth. We made this day unforgettable." For a heartbeat, the room stilled again, and then he added, almost gently, that he had one more announcement to make. He turned toward Vanessa, who had stood in the shadows all evening, head bowed, shoulders trembling, and said with piercing clarity, "I am no longer your fiancé." Vanessa let out a soft, broken sob, her lips parting but no words emerging, while Michael kept his gaze on her for a long second, then shifted it back to the crowd. "I'll remember this day for the rest of my life," he told them, "but not as the day I celebrated love. I'll remember it as the day I learned to let go." He set the microphone back on its stand, picked up his car keys from the table, and walked toward the exit with a composure that made the silence even heavier. At the door, he turned once more, his final words striking like a gavel. "Life is a performance, and the only thing that matters is making sure you are the leading role." The hush that followed was absolute, and when the door closed behind him, the ballroom remained frozen, a room full of stunned faces left to grapple with the truth they had just witnessed. The hush inside the ballroom only broke once Michael had disappeared through the doors, and then the room erupted into whispers and fragmented conversations, voices tripping over one another as people tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Vanessa stood alone in the center of it all, her dress rumpled, her face streaked with tears, and yet no one moved toward her. It was as though the crowd itself had drawn back, leaving her stranded in a circle of shame, untouchable despite the dozens of bodies around her. That was the moment everyone understood the truth. In this cruel and twisted theater, the only victor was Michael. He had taken control of the story, and she had been left with nothing but the silence of her own disgrace. The months that followed stretched on like a punishment, long and heavy, filled with shadows that refused to let go. Michael abandoned the city where everything had fallen apart, leaving behind not only the broken pieces of his engagement, but the people who had seen him at his lowest. He needed a place where no one knew the details, where he could rebuild without the constant weight of pity or gossip. So he found himself in a small coastal town in California, a place that smelled of salt and seaweed, where the ocean could drown out the noise of the past. It was there, on a quiet side street, that he opened a bar, simple, warm, wooden floors and neon signs, soft music humming from an old speaker in the corner. Work gave him a rhythm, something to hold on to when his mind wanted to circle back to the wreckage. Wiping down counters, hauling crates of beer, nodding to the same regulars who trickled in at dusk, it all gave him a sense of purpose, small but real. The bar became his shield, the place where he could remind himself that survival was possible, that he could create something with his own hands, even if it was only a space for strangers to laugh and drink and forget their troubles. For him, survival meant pretending that the wounds had healed, that the blood had dried and left only faint scars. But when it came to love, the scars never seemed to fade. He dated, casually at first, women who came and went like summer storms, each connection brief and shallow, each encounter dissolving into the same emptiness once the door closed behind them. He told himself he was fine, that he didn't need permanence, that fleeting comfort was enough. Yet in the quiet hours after closing, when the lights dimmed and the smell of beer still hung in the air, the loneliness pressed in again. None of those women carried the weight of history he had shared with Vanessa. None of them could touch the space she had once filled, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, the truth sat with him like a shadow at the end of every night. Every morning, Michael woke up with the same mantra, muttered to himself as though repetition might carve it into reality. I'm fine. I've moved on. I'm over her. And yet, like a cruel trick, the ghosts returned the moment he blinked into the light. The memory of Vanessa's laugh, the way her warmth once filled a room, the curve of her face that seemed to haunt him more vividly with time. It was maddening, the way the betrayal clung like a film he couldn't wash away, reminding him that he was still chained to the bathroom stall of that night, no matter how far he had run. One evening, after dragging himself home from another long day at the bar, he slipped his keys from his pocket and opened the small metal mailbox beside his door. Inside lay a single envelope, thick and deliberate, with his name scrawled across it in handwriting that jolted him like a bolt of electricity. He knew it instantly. Vanessa's hand, the same loops and curves he had once found charming. His chest tightened as he stepped inside his apartment, dropping his bag carelessly onto the floor before collapsing onto the couch, with the envelope gripped tight in his hand, the paper suddenly heavy with everything he wasn't ready to face. For long minutes, he simply stared at it, the edges cutting into his palm, fighting the urge to rip it apart unopened. He wanted to destroy it, to prove to himself that she no longer held any power over him. But curiosity, that relentless enemy, wore him down until his fingers betrayed him, tearing it open. Inside was a plain sheet of paper covered with her words, her voice spilling out in ink as if she were sitting across from him. She admitted the unforgivable, confessed her regret, with a softness that almost made it worse. Michael, I know I have no right to write you. I made a mistake I will pay for all my life. But I need you to know, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I miss you. I don't ask for anything but the chance to talk. If you're willing, I'll be waiting. She signed it simply, always yours, Vanessa. His hands trembled as he read, once, twice, again and again, the words etching deeper instead of fading. Rage flared hot. His first impulse was to shred the letter, to crush it into nothing, to reclaim the power she had stolen. He balled it tightly in his fist, his knuckles whitening, ready to cast it aside. But then, inexplicably, he faltered. Slowly, almost shamefully, he uncurled his fingers, smoothing the paper with trembling hands. He rose, walked to the table, and, in a surreal act of defiance against himself, pulled out a bottle of glue. Piece by piece he pressed the torn fragments back together, as if holding on to it, even in its broken form, was the only way to confront what he still couldn't let go. Michael stared at the page for what felt like hours, the words burning into him, not because they carried comfort, but because they stripped open every wound he thought he had stitched closed. What nonsense, he muttered under his breath, his chest tightening with a swirl of fury and confusion that left him unable to move. Rage coursed through him like a fever, but tangled up with it was something softer, something he hated even more. Curiosity. He wanted to dismiss her, to call it pathetic, to shred the memory and move on, but the letter sat there like a living thing, demanding his attention. For days he left it on the table, sometimes glaring at it, sometimes brushing his fingers over its edges as though trying to absorb the weight of what she had said without admitting he cared. A week later, after countless nights of restless sleep and endless debates with himself, Michael finally gave in. He sat down with a cheap ballpoint pen and a sheet of paper, the words spilling out harsher than he even intended. Vanessa, what exactly are you trying to prove with this letter? Why should I believe a single thing you say when you betrayed me in the cruelest way possible? He signed it curtly, Michael, and mailed it before he could change his mind. He told himself it was over, that she wouldn't answer, that even if she did, he wouldn't read it. but when the next envelope arrived only a few days later, his hands trembled as he tore it open. Her reply was startling in its rawness. Vanessa didn't defend herself, didn't cloak her words in excuses. She admitted everything with a clarity that almost hurt more than the act itself. She called it immaturity, fear, stupidity, and she said it had destroyed not only his life, but her own. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't try to bargain. She simply laid the truth bare. That brutal honesty disarmed him in a way he hadn't expected. It was as though for the first time since that night, he was hearing her without the fog of chaos and rage clouding his vision. Against his better judgment, he sat down and wrote back. What followed was a strange rhythm of letters, at first cold, more interrogation than conversation. He grilled her with questions meant to slice, to wound, to prove that she was only out to break him again. "Are you trying to ruin me a second time?" he demanded in one note. Her reply came back steady, almost gentle. "No, Michael, I just want to tell you the truth." And so it continued, the back and forth like a cautious dance over broken glass, each word pulling him closer to the past he swore he had buried, and yet keeping him tethered to her in a way he no longer knew how to resist. Over time, their letters shifted, softening from interrogation into something unexpected. What began as cold exchanges soon carried fragments of the past, small memories of happier days that slipped in between the lines. Vanessa would remind him of a road trip they once took down the coast, the way the car smelled of salt and sunscreen, how they'd laughed when the radio got stuck on one static-filled station. Michael found himself smiling despite the bitterness he still clung to, catching glimpses of what they had been before everything shattered. It was dangerous, he knew, to let nostalgia carve through his defenses, but there it was, pulling him back into the warmth he thought he'd buried forever. After months of letters that became longer, more personal, Michael finally wrote something that surprised even him. "Come by the bar." He told himself it was curiosity, closure maybe, but the truth was more complicated. The night of their meeting, he stood behind the bar, straightening bottles that didn't need straightening, his stomach tight with anticipation. When the door creaked open, he looked up, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Vanessa stepped inside, but she wasn't the woman he remembered. Her clothes were simple, her face bare, stripped of the armor of makeup she once never left the house without. Her eyes had lost the brazen confidence that had both captivated and infuriated him. They looked different now, uncertain, almost fragile. "Hi," she said softly, the single word trembling in the air between them. He forced out his own greeting, short and flat, though inside he felt a jolt of anger tangled with an odd kind of relief he couldn't explain. They sat at a small corner table, the hum of the jukebox filling the silence that stretched far too long. Finally, she asked how he was, her voice careful, as though she were approaching a wild animal. "Fine," he answered, clipped and guarded, and the word hung there like a locked door. She began to tell her story then, not with excuses, but with bare admissions, about losing her job, about friends who turned their backs, about nights spent alone with nothing but her guilt. She admitted that Kevin had left her within weeks, once his bruises faded and his interest waned, and then she looked straight into Michael's eyes and told him she wasn't writing to win him back or erase the past. She wrote because only with him had she ever felt truly happy. Something in her tone disarmed him, and before he realized it, he was suggesting they see each other again. From there, their time together grew in hesitant steps, two people circling one another carefully, as though rediscovering a language they once spoke fluently but had long forgotten. Vanessa worked hard to show him she had changed, not with grand declarations, but in small, quiet ways that were harder to ignore. She folded herself into the rhythm of Michael's life, helping him behind the bar when things grew hectic, scrubbing counters without being asked, and standing beside him when exhaustion wore him thin. On weekends, they would walk along the shore, the ocean air carrying their conversations into places they hadn't dared revisit before. They spoke of choices they wished had gone differently, of the people they might have been if not for that night, and in those moments Michael felt the armor he had built so carefully start to crack. The laughter came easier, the silences less heavy, and he began to wonder if perhaps forgiveness wasn't a destination, but a road he had already started walking. One evening, after a long walk along the boardwalk, they ended up at his apartment, the air still carrying the salt of the sea. Michael looked at her in the dim light, and all the feelings he had tried to bury surged to the surface with a force he couldn't fight. He leaned toward her, tentative at first, but the moment their lips met, hesitation dissolved into something raw and aching. Vanessa kissed him back without pause, and for the first time in years, he felt the warmth of closeness that had been missing from his life, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you remember what it feels like to be alive. Later that night, lying side by side in the quiet glow of the room, Michael realized the truth he had been running from. His love for her had never burned out. It had been smothered, wounded, buried under anger and betrayal, but it was still there, pulsing steadily beneath the wreckage. Yet that recognition came with no clean resolution. The kiss, the closeness, the way her hand rested gently on his arm, they couldn't erase the memory of her pressed against someone else in a tiled bathroom. Love might have survived, but trust was another story, and he knew better than to confuse the two. At dawn, the first slivers of sunlight slipped between the blinds, and Michael stirred while she still slept. Her breathing was soft, her face unguarded, stripped of the masks she once wore even at home, and for a fleeting moment she looked like the girl he had fallen for years ago. He rose quietly, moving into the kitchen, while the coffee pot hissed and bubbled, the smell of it filling the small apartment. Leaning against the counter, he stared out the window at the city stirring awake, and asked himself the question he had been avoiding. Could he truly live with what she had done? The warmth of her presence tugged at him, but the shadow of betrayal lingered, reminding him that love alone was never simple, never enough. The smell of coffee drifted through the small apartment, the pot sputtering softly on the stove as Michael leaned against the counter and stared out at the city easing itself awake. He asked himself the question he had been circling for months. Am I happy? The answer came quickly, almost involuntarily. Yes, there was warmth in him again, a comfort he hadn't felt since before his world collapsed. Yet the warmth didn't arrive alone. It carried with it a heavy shadow. Last night had felt right, achingly right, the way it used to when their laughter filled every corner of their lives. But beneath that tenderness lurked the image that still haunted him. Vanessa's arms wrapped around another man in the most unforgivable of places. When she finally stirred half an hour later, he was already sitting at the table, cradling a mug between his palms as though it might steady him. She walked in quietly, her hair tousled, her face softened by sleep, and when she rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch was tentative, almost reverent. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice gentle. "Morning," he replied, clipped but not unkind, the word leaving him flat, weighted. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decode what lived behind his silence. Then she sat across from him, gathering her breath, and told him she didn't know what he felt, but if there was even the faintest chance he could forgive, she was willing to wait as long as it took. He held her gaze for what felt like forever, his thoughts colliding in his chest, and then he nodded once. "Don't push me," he said finally. "I have to figure it out myself." The day stretched on endlessly after that, thick and heavy like syrup, each task at the bar punctuated by thoughts that pulled him back to her. Could he forgive her? And if he did, what would that forgiveness mean? Would it be strength, or would it be weakness disguised as mercy? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let him breathe. He carried them like stones in his pockets, each one weighing him down, no matter how many drinks he poured or jokes he forced with customers. By nightfall, the memories had crept back in, weaving themselves into everything. He saw again her tear-streaked face on their wedding night, the devastation she wore like a mask. He remembered her letters, the brutal honesty in her handwriting that struck him harder than excuses ever could, and with every recollection came the truth he had tried so hard to deny. He still loved her. That love was twisted, bruised, tangled up in anger and doubt, but it had survived the fire. And now he had to face the hardest part, that sometimes surviving love doesn't make it easier to live with. Michael often found himself staring at the bar he had built with his own 2 hands, the wood grain polished by his labor, the lights casting a glow that felt both warm and foreign. He would think about how love and hate weren't opposites at all, but twin poles of the same force, pushing and pulling him in ways he couldn't escape. The wound of betrayal still throbbed deep inside him, not yet scarred, just barely clotting over, tender at every touch. Yet alongside that pain, love remained, stubborn and resilient, refusing to be extinguished no matter how hard he tried. It was maddening to live with both, to feel as though his heart was a battlefield where neither side would surrender. One evening, as the sun fell, they sat together on the terrace of his apartment, the ocean breeze carrying the last warmth of the day. The wine in their glasses caught the fading light, glinting in hues of gold and rose. Vanessa's voice wrapped around him as she told some story from their past, and without warning, he felt a smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't meant to, hadn't planned to give her that victory, but the memory pulled him back anyway. She laughed, reminding him of the night he'd clumsily fought with a champagne bottle on his birthday, unable to pop the cork. "Don't remind me," he muttered with mock irritation, but even he couldn't suppress the grin that followed. Her laughter rang out, light and unburdened, and for a fleeting moment it felt like no time had passed at all, like the years of anger and silence had been nothing more than a bad dream. They laughed together until the sound folded into the quiet of the evening, and when it faded, something tender lingered in its place. For the first time in so long, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was easy, familiar, like slipping into an old sweater that still fit just right. She turned to him then, her eyes shining in the amber light, and whispered her gratitude, thanking him for giving her another chance, for even sitting there beside her. The words hit him harder than he expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, stripped of the vanity she once carried like armor. He didn't answer. He just watched her, the curve of her smile, the way the wind tugged at her hair, softening her into someone he almost didn't recognize. Everything about the moment looked right, as though life itself was asking him to choose forgiveness. Yet deep inside, he still felt the splinter of doubt, sharp and unyielding, reminding him that even the warmest sunset couldn't erase the shadow of betrayal. Deep down, Michael knew the doubt still lived in him, heavy and unresolved. "Can I really live with this?" he asked himself silently, with the weight of what she did, with the memory of that night carved so deep. Will I ever be able to trust her completely again, or will this shadow trail me forever? He tilted his head back toward the sky, where the first stars blinked into view, small sparks against the indigo of evening, and he felt the question press harder than any answer he could give. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, he thought, turning the idea over in his mind like a stone he couldn't stop touching. But what if he wasn't ready to receive it? What if holding on to the pain felt safer than letting it go? Vanessa's voice pulled him out of his spiral, calling his name, her tone gentle, curious. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He forced a smile, masking the ache beneath it, and answered with a light quip about how terrible the wine was. She laughed, the sound easing the air between them, and for a moment it felt like life had softened again, offering him peace in small doses. Yet even as her laughter faded into the hum of the evening, the doubt remained, lodged deep like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He looked at her, the curve of her mouth, the glint of her eyes in the fading light, and for a fleeting second he wanted to believe this was enough, that the warmth of the present could silence the ghosts of the past. But the truth whispered from somewhere he couldn't silence. Shadows don't vanish just because you stop looking at them. They wait, patient, quiet, ready to remind you of everything you wish you could forget. And so he sat there on the terrace, caught between past and future, holding on to a moment that asked nothing of him but acceptance. Maybe that was the point, that life wasn't about finding the perfect answers, but about learning to live with the questions. He breathed in the night air, letting it settle into his chest, and decided he didn't need to know today whether forgiveness would come or whether trust would ever return. For now, it was enough to be still, to acknowledge the weight and the warmth, and to understand that sometimes surviving the story is the only ending you get. And if you've been listening to me all the way through this story, I'd really love to hear what you think. Do you believe forgiveness is ever truly possible after a betrayal like this? Or do those scars stay with us forever? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your stories and your opinions matter just as much as mine. And if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you want to hear more of these raw, honest journeys.